Hello and welcome back to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Anne Green. I'm Principal and CEO of the GNS Integrated Marketing Communications Group. And I'm so delighted today to be joined by Ethan McCarty. Hi, Ethan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Anne. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah. So, Ethan, just for background for our listeners that don't know him, he and I've gotten to know each other the last few years through the Page Society, which has been wonderful. But Ethan has a really interesting background, 13 years at IBM and all kinds of, this is just a short list of your whole life. I'm not going to go through everything there, right? But
Ethan McCarty, this is your life.
this is your life. Bring on some surprise guests. It'll be exciting.
Amazing.
But at IBM, and really during, I think, some golden years at IBM, although IBM continues to be such a thriving organization, but corp comms, content, internal comms, digital and social strategy, you were at Bloomberg as head of employee and innovation communications, which I thought was really cool. But then most notably, you founded your own shop in 2018 named Integral that focuses on employee activation, employee experience, employee engagement. So there are a lot of things I want to talk to you about today, as you know, because it is a crazy world for organizations and alike. And I think just to set up the conversation, it is a challenging landscape for both people, individuals, and organizations. There's a lot to experience and navigate right now, and it's quite symbiotic. And I think as two organizational leaders, we're both client counselors and we're both organizational leaders, and we're both very worried about internal and external comms. I just love to start riffing on the big picture, the macro impact to both individuals and organizations under these pressures. In what ways do you think they're similar, individual versus organization? In what ways do you think they're distinct, Ethan, how people are experiencing this?
Wow. We all operate in the context of our society and the sort of group identities that we're affiliated with, whether you think of yourself as an American or a European or, a Northern Hemispherian or smaller communities like, I feel like I'm part of my family or, my faith or whatever. And, there's so much change happening at those sort of macro levels that we then have to integrate as individuals. And so, when you have, the level of, not just the frequency of changes that are happening in very significant ways, but the level of those changes. So the significance of frequent change. It's not just like, the color of houses is changing or something, like literally the fabric of our society is changing, it seems like, on a daily basis. And so organizations need to accommodate those, and so do individuals. And it gets down, I think, to a very sort of existential level where we're thinking about our identities as individuals. What does this mean for me as a dad or as somebody who lives in Brooklyn versus what does this mean for, an organization like my company? And so I think, your setup at the beginning, Anne, is very on point. We're, the two of us are, constantly navigating the space in between those sort of brand identities for our clients and for our own companies, and then our individual identities and how we relate to the people we care about. So I think, that VUCA thing, which, by the way, every time I hear VUCA, I think of Veruca Salt from Willy Wonka. But
I think of Vulcans because I'm a 70s Star Trek girl, so it says Vulcan to me, but I think you're closer with Veruca for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. They both had to experience a lot of change, right?
That's true.
What do you think? What do you think? That sort of tension between the what's happening en masse and what's happening for us as individuals?
Yeah, I think tension's a good way to describe it. And I want to get into that in a moment because I want to dig into what you're saying. I think it's very much related to the idea of identity. And I want to get to that question of values, which to me is an essential tension. But, even before we get there, it makes me think about that whole nomenclature of employee experience, or as you say on your website, employee activation, or you've been dealing with and that interplay between the organization and the person, right? And I've had folks on the podcast before talking about it. I find it like a really rich, vein to mine. But in all of the years in the arc of your career we talked about earlier, how do you understand those concepts? And then let's get back into what you were talking about a moment ago.
Well, I think if you Google the phrase change management is dead, you'll find many, many articles going back for a long time. Same thing with knowledge management, by the way. But I think it's particular. at this point, having, sort of been working for nearly 30 years,
Mhm.
I believe that more now than ever. I mean, like people have always been saying, I mean, since I've been in the workforce in the late 90s, people have been saying like, change is the new constant. But my sense of it right now is that this idea that there's periods of stasis that are prolonged, interrupted by these sort of, episodes of significant change that need to be then, managed. And then there's sort of a beginning, middle, and end to that change. And then we're back to this period of stasis and stability that's going to last a long time. I do think that's kind of done. I mean, you have it in, sort of in, layers within an organization, like, oh, okay, so these things may be constant for a while. And then we're going to have a big change. Like, okay, we've deployed a big enterprise resource planning system, and we're probably not going to do that for another few years. Okay, sure. You probably need some traditional change management, change communication around that. But the VUCA of it all is happening constantly. So, even those periods of stasis, they're kind of one dimensional. And, what you're having is, relative stability in one dimension of your life or your organization or your business strategy. Meanwhile, everything else is changing. And so, I liken it to spinning plates. I always think about that, it's like you're spinning plates and, you've kind of got these broomsticks or whatever, and you're spinning plates on top of them. And there's probably a couple of them that you can turn your back on, but maybe just for a minute. And I think that's where, I mean, frankly, there's never been a better time to be in the communications profession because it's ever more strategic. I mean, I was actually just talking with a friend of mine who I was in the Future Leaders Experience with like 15 years ago. She's now chief communications officer of a major telecom company. And she was like, oh my God, when we were in the Future Leaders program, which is a Page Society program, I thought, you'd be chief communications officer would mostly like handle PR, and for the CEO. And now I'm doing, government relations, investor relations, the employees, the communities that we're in. Suddenly, they're a company that's really mostly operating in the United States. She's doing international relations. I mean, it's just such a different role and level of complexity that people in our profession are contending with. It's really exciting. It's very interesting. The opportunity landscape is really, really rich. It's also super stressful. It's super high risk. And it's really, I mean, frankly, it's scary and it's complex. And there's all these, layers of change. So even if you get that one plate spinning and you're feeling good about that, chances are there's another one that's, next to hitting the floor.
I love the plate spinning analogy. My analogy is the old carnival game, whack-a-mole.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
the moles pop up and you hit them with the big rubber hammer. And I always I've joked for decades because I've been in doing this since like 92, 93. So it's been over 30 years now in agency side, all agency side, large agency, and then building an agency over decades. And now CEO again at a mid-sized larger firm. I've always felt that whack-a-mole was a good analogy because there's always something popping up, right?
That's
People,
right.
clients, the world, and the moles are not hiding out down there. They're not sleeping, and it's constant, and you never know where they're going to pop up. And I think these metaphors are helpful, but I do think that even though I've thought of it that way for a long time, the intensity is ratcheted up so much.
Yeah.
And you're right; it's very, very interesting, almost too interesting at times. So that's part of. I've spent a lot of time recently contemplating sort of the organizational level of that as a person like yourself that's responsible for people, that's responsible for a brand, ourselves, and then is also responsible for our clients and thinking deeply about their business and not just them as an entity, but their people and all those levels. And remember back in the day, Ethan, how external and internal communications is like never the twain shall meet and or
Right.
external matters. So it's like the people internally doing internal comms. I've been saying for years also that's like the drop in the pond where the rings radiate out. The first ring is your own people, right? And it's very symbiotic. It flows through. So I think we understand that more now. And that's a good transition to sort of the heart of the conversation. It goes back to what you're saying before, which is I see a very pervasive and common tension, no surprise, when it comes to the values of an organization relative to the values of the individual staff members.
Yeah.
And I think that feels to me more salient than ever right now. And I think we're going to have a chance to unpack that. But I do find it persistently hard to unpack. I find this dynamic tension to never feel resolved. I mean, first of all, do you agree with that assertion? Does that resonate with you?
Oh, 100%. I mean, in fact, even the name of my company, Integral, the sort of root of it was I was having a conversation with my old colleague Ben Edwards, who was for a time at IBM and at The Economist and PayPal, and we were. This is almost 10 years before I started the company, and we were just talking about this idea of individual identity and the brand. And, because I was running social media for IBM at the time. And, I had this notion that, individuals could confer a sense of authenticity to a brand, and brands could, confer a sense of authority to an individual. And there was like this value exchange that was happening, in social media for big companies, and, getting employees to be enlisted as advocates for their brand. But one of the things that, was to me very apparent was that one's identity, it has to be like, there's a sense of integrity to one's identity, like wholeness, not integrity, like, following the rules or, ethical behavior or what have you, but that integrity, like it's able to hold together. And when you have to sort of traverse this space between, the brand, like, oh, I'm an IBMer versus like, oh, I'm Ethan. The larger that space is, the more that you're going to be sort of, spending your day with this sense of cognitive dissonance, where you have to believe two opposing ideas, like, oh, I'm like this whole set of values that IBM purports to hold versus the set of values that I know myself to hold. If those are not aligned, I'm going to feel a lot of stress. Cognitive dissonance really is like crazy making. It causes a lot of stress. It causes people to behave in erratic ways, antisocial ways. I mean, things that you would, that you would say, like, you don't want those kind of behaviors. And so many years later, when I did start this company, and yes, the idea of that integrity is in the name of, my business, but we started to do some research around this. And we do this research every year with the Harris poll, where we look at, one of the things that we ask people is, well, do you know what the company's values are? Are they exhibited, at the company? Do you see those, like that's actually real, or is it just poster sort of fodder for the walls, and then how much do those track with your own sense of values? And one of the things that we found is that the more those correlated, the more that people, and it's again and again, now we're going into our 5th year of doing this research. And, again and again, we see that when people feel high alignment between their company's stated values and their personal values, they're like 200% more likely to do things like, volunteer, go the extra mile for a colleague, and participate in mentorship programs, do extra to satisfy a client or a customer's needs, even buy the company's stock. Like all these, what I would call pro-social behaviors, go up by an enormous, just categorically different level of that kind of behavior. And then likewise, the behaviors that people, the behaviors that people are likely to exhibit in the workplace that are negative, things like ignoring safety protocols, or protesting against a company, warning a candidate away, or posting something negative about the company online, those go through the roof equally. And even 17% of people, around 18% of people who have that low values alignment, say they would outright sabotage the company, which is, to me, that's just like mind blowing. We put that in almost as a lark, like, oh, I wonder if like anybody would say they'd sabotage the company, or say a colleague would sabotage the company. And fully 17% in the first year that we did that study. And that's where, when you see things online, when you see these videos of people, like chucking a box, or, putting something weird in somebody's food, or, you hear about somebody doing something like horrible in a healthcare, whatever, those behaviors, they didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't come. That's not like a bad seed necessarily. There's probably some really big disconnect in between what's going on inside that person's mind and that person's life, and what's going inside that person's employer, like that company.
It's interesting to think about this. And I love that research. That's one of the reasons why I reached out to want to speak to you, because you were doing some interesting posts on LinkedIn about some dimensions of this, which we're going to get into in a minute, where that values alignment or disalignment is in great tension. I think
Yeah.
as much tension as ever right now, right? But you're reminding me of how we represent corporate life and culture. So, for example, on the more benign side, there's the cartoon Dilbert. For those who don't know, Google it. But it's Dilbert, to me, the whole vibe of Dilbert is management. It's like poor Dilbert is powerless in the, the maw of, dumb managers. There's also Office Space, and there's The Office. And then if you go up the chain to stuff that's a bit more intense, there's Severance now, which is a very literal and metaphorical representation of the inside and outside person, that person that is in cognitive dissonance between their organizational self and their private self. And so, one of my first questions to you, I personally feel this is probably irresolvable. Like, you're never going to get complete alignment, because it's just, there's people have many dimensions to them. A company is not going to be all things. And I don't personally believe in the bring your whole self to work as something that can be fully fulfilled, nor should it be to me. But how do you see, what are the practices that companies start to enact to assess that they have a values gap between themselves and their staff, and then start to figure out how they bring that Venn diagram, those two circles, into closer alignment so they don't have those terrible outcomes that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the examples, and I'm kind of obsessed with Severance. I think it's it's an amazing social critique, because it basically is asserting that it's irreconcilable. This difference between like my internal self and like who I have to be in order to be a successful professional. And the only way that we could possibly navigate that would be, like separating the hemispheres of our brains or something like really radical, like a surgical procedure.
Neither of us believe it to that degree, but it is an interesting concept. Isn't it?
I mean, it's totally fascinating. And I tend to agree with you. Like the idea of having total overlap, the opposite of severance, like having total confluence or whatever the opposite would be equally nightmarish. It's like I certainly don't want my employees to submit their entire personalities to the integral brand. And, and I'm a founder. I mean, like, it's like really intense for a founder, I mean, like this whole thing, like the name of the company came to me in a dream. I mean, like this is like very personal for me, and even so, like, when I leave work, like I really want to spend time with my kids and put the phone away. And, like I have a very separate life outside of work. And I think that should be cherished and honored. I think where most companies sort of miss the opportunity to at least tighten up that Venn diagram a bit on around the most important issues is to gain an understanding of what those issues are to the employees who work in your organization. And so, I mean, look, very, very early, my point of view of this is highly, highly shaped by Mike Wing and John Iwata at IBM, who were my leaders when I was early in my career. And we did this whole practice called the Values Jam. And we were doing these sort of like giant online dialogues. There's a great HBR piece. I think it's authored by the CEO at the time, Sam Palmisano, that describes what happened in Values Jam. But essentially, we said, all right, there's about 400,000 of us here. What do we believe in? Mm-hmm. And we had this, I mean, it was very, very early. So the technology was like really wonky and all this kind of stuff. But we had this massive online conversation and then distilled that down into a new set of values that endure to this day. And the preceding set were articulated by the founders of the company, by the Watson family, 100 years earlier. So it was time to check in with a contemporary workforce on what a contemporary set of values would look like for, like if we wanted that company to last another 100 years. And even though I think that's like 20 years ago now at this point, but I think that at the heart of it, what's so correct about that is listening first. And so if you're able to do that, and I'm not saying, I mean, leaders should lead, right? But leaders should lead the people that are following them with some real high, emotional sensitivity, intellectual curiosity, and compassion for the folks that they're leading. And how can you possibly do that if you haven't gained through really intentional, large scale, frequent check-ins, listening, and not the, once every other year employee engagement survey. I mean, those have their place. Those are good, and also not enough. And so, I mean, like, if you think about any relationship that you have in your life, if that's meaningful to you, if that person only checked in with you once every 2 years, like, what would you think of that relationship? You would not feel valued, right? And so it'd be very hard to share values with that person. Well, same thing goes here. And so, I mean, this is again, it's not some, like, back 20 years ago for IBM, it was enormously expensive to kind of pull that kind of thing off. I mean, you can swipe a credit card and do that, like, with some SaaS software tomorrow at pretty much any company. So that's really the point of departure. If you can understand what the sensibilities are, and then ultimately you may need to shift those. And that may become, as you articulate a set of values that inform your culture, your business strategy, how you show up as a company, how those individual employees show up to each other. That may end up being a passive filter. Like, there may be a lot of people who are like, yeah, actually, that's not for me. And that's okay. That's cool. There's probably a great place for them to go work, and that has, some values that are more concomitant with their own and harmonious with their own worldview and so on. And that's great. That's probably going to be a good thing. And then it's going to be an attractor for people who see those values in action in everything from your marketing and employer website to how you actually show up to your customers, what kind of products you produce, and so on. And that's, I think, the opportunity, which is enormous.
I love this conversation about rerouting ourselves in this practice of listening, compassion, being open to dialogue, and then leaders leading too. I had to learn some hard lessons. People who worked with me when I was a CEO and a COO the first time watched me sort of learn in live time the difference between creating consensus and deciding when it's time to lead. Where do we figure out, and how do we figure out as leaders, but both as individual contributors, employees, how we define our own values? What is value-based living for us? That's something I've worked on in therapy. What's a value-based approach to my life? How do I look at that as a leader? How do we understand where we come together and where we are apart? And you're right. How is it individuals make a choice to say, this is not my set of values, I want to move on? I say leave with love at that point.
Leaders need to respect that too, and not, see that as worthy of punishment. That's a great choice, and you should support people and all, and ensure that. I love that idea of leave with love, and separate with some dignity there, and it will speak well. Like, there's nothing you can do better. I think there's nothing you could do to attract great talent than be respectful in all phases of it with your current talent.
Yes.
And so if people see, like, oh, okay, that person has had like a great tenure there, and then they went on to go do something else, that's awesome. That's probably going to be a real big attractor for talent.
I think it's interesting what you're saying, Ethan, and I've reflected on this a lot in terms of the grace with which folks leave an organization, whether they're making that choice or whether they're not, which is even harder. Something I've experienced many times as a leader, having to make that kind of decision. But I do feel that dynamic tension between the organization and the individual is often on display in very negative ways with leaders when they treat folks that are leaving as if they've been personally affronted. And it's just such a bad situation. So I think you're right. That whole life cycle of the relationship is so critical.
For a while, I ran IBM's alumni program. And what was kind of interesting about the choice that my boss made was, like, you're going to run the intranet and you're going to run the alumni program at the same time, which was fascinating because, here we have two networks of people who have a lot in common, having, especially, with IBM, which is a brand that does such important imprinting, like the identity and the culture, it's like so heavy, like when you're an IBMer, it's like, that's a thing, it's like, it's almost like a invention of IBM, this identity of the IBMer. And, when you leave IBM, and IBM is, somebody who's left IBM, we were trying to change the language. They're not an ex-IBMer, they're an IBM alum. And because there's such a positive, sort of rotating door there, where people would go out of IBM, gain some industry experience, some new contacts, and then come back, or just become clients of IBM, customers. And, And so I think if you think about like in terms of the identity vector here, like you have come and identified, especially in North America. I mean, it's not the same for everyone, but in North America, there's a high association with your profession and your identity. You ask somebody what they do in North America, and chances are they're going to tell you what they do for a living. They're not going to say like, oh, I make candles and, I'd like to go jogging. They're probably going to lead with their profession. And so if you honor that level where people really integrate a brand into their personal identity, that can be very powerful just in terms of the meaning of their work and their lives. And also it's incredibly strategically valuable for an organization to maintain that kind of bond with people. And, as you were saying earlier about this kind of like tops down, command and control, that kind of management system really has its place. Like that is a very valuable, that's not like a dumb management system. It just doesn't tend to build those kind of deep hooks into people's souls in a way and people's, individual identities. And it also doesn't scale very well. It's really, really hard to do that kind of command and control thing at scale. And so like what I see happening in government right now is almost like a descaling that's happening. Whereas if you can, I mean, I just remember, thinking about the values, and I ended up, when I was at the New School for Social Research, I ended up writing my master's thesis about this idea of values and culture as a management system. And, because I had experienced it firsthand at IBM. And I think that, if you can set up those right, values and sort of cultural assumptions that people will make, in the day-to-day work, that is going to free leaders to do so much more. You don't have to be there checking everything because that on principle, the decisions will be made in a way that aligns with your strategy, how you would do it. The why is understood by everybody. And so values and culture are, to me, they're not a nice to have, foosball tables and whatever. That's a strategic asset that should be cultivated and managed. And I think that the savvy CEOs who really want to scale, who really want to do something big and empower people who want to come and do something big, like that's the way to get there, as opposed to come work at this job that's super well defined, do XYZ in that order, because that's what I've said. And then if you haven't done it right, there's a punitive sort of consequence.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that for many organizations, the values equation you're talking about is more effective. I agree with you. The command and control, I mean, obviously military operations and things like that need that chain of command, and they function very well. And if they didn't have it, that would have dire consequences. So I think that's a really good point. In terms of this discussion again about the organizational values, personal values, the delta, the distance of the delta between them, I just want to talk about a few things that are going on to sort of real-time tests of this. Maybe it's like not a speed round, but we'll go through a couple. Okay. One of them is politics in the workplace. And I wrote in my notes, yikes, this one is tough. True. Particularly over the past year, but certainly today. So the conventional wisdom, and this is something we talk about in the circles we run in all the time, there's a conventional wisdom not to bring or allow politics in the workplace. But to me, that's really not helpful nor realistic. And you posted a great short commentary on this on LinkedIn, which is literally, while it was like, I have to reach out to Ethan to talk about this.
Thanks.
Give me your take on this. And I know you have some data on it too, but what's your take on that question, which is real profound right now?
Yeah, I mean, like we found in our research that pretty consistently about half of the employed population would like to be able to speak about politics and social issues in the workplace. They feel like they should be able to do that. About half believe that that they have the right to do it, and they're empowered to do that. However, it gets kind of more interesting when you look at both positionally and generationally. It will probably not surprise anybody that millennials are way higher. They're pulling that number, that 50% number, way up, and boomers are bringing it down to some degree, as are Gen Xers. Gen Z also tends to be a little bit lower. We think that's positional. We think that's like because they might be in more junior positions. They might feel a little bit less empowered in the workplace just because of where they are in the organization. But the sort of TLDR is get ready for a workforce that is much more interested in talking about social and political issues at work and feel that they have the right to do so. And so that is coming. That's already here. It's already here, but it's coming more. And then also so before I go on to another sort of dimension of that, what I would say the approach needs to be is depending on what kinds of spaces that you operate in, like a retail organization is going to be different from one that's manufacturing or a pharmaceutical organization. And even within those, like you're going to have an itinerant sales force and you're going to have people who are manufacturing, so there's a wide variety of sort of spaces, whether they're digital spaces like a chat room or physical spaces like a break room or a town hall meeting with whatever those spaces are where people gather in your organization. You just need to be very, very prescriptive about what the rules of the road are. And I think that's a really good way to start. It's just like, even if you just say, look, we are not going to use any language that is, hostile, denigrating, like that's a great start. And most organizations have those kind of things in place already, but you need to signal that again and again and again. So if you have a Slack channel that says, I find it so funny, like when you go buy Slack or deploy Slack, it comes preloaded with this general, this category where it's like just general, like anybody can talk about anything. The first thing you should do is rename that and put something in there. It's like general, but also not racist, or like, but also not about, your political affiliation, or, like put something in there that helps people understand like, okay, yeah, we're interested. This is a place where we can talk, but we're also like, here's what we think, the appropriate kind of discourse is in this venue. So being really clear about the rules of the road, I think is the first step. And then also, the other thing is to really reward and lionize people who do it well. There are people who are going to be natural conveners and community leaders. And if you can lionize that behavior, if you can like make those folks the star of the show, give them some mechanism for convening people, I don't know, like $50 budget to buy donuts and coffee. I mean, like that can be huge, because they're doing it in a way that is really pro-social. And that could be around, okay, well, this issue, I'm going to make this up, this issue of homelessness is really important in a particular area. Great. We want to talk about that. Let's fund the ability for that team who really cares about it to go do a volunteer project, and they can talk about homelessness all the time there because they're really engaged in doing some solution around it, as opposed to sort of getting into the political sphere and talking about policy issue, which the company may not have any, like impact on at all.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because another piece of this is, what do companies speak out about or not speak out about? And I think these are also very symbiotic. And one of the things I've been trying to reflect on as a CEO is, what is the foundational context or the lens I can offer staff that I've been thinking about, that we can share a language and also share a set of values about how we engage, right? So a value of engagement and a value of connection and communication, but also values of respect. One of the things I tried to do last year was reflect on, what does it mean to be in a pluralistic society? What does it mean to stay in community and tough conversations? What does it mean to hold someone's humanity, even when you're very upset about something? What does it mean to grapple with the idea that someone's vote may land differently for them than for you? And also to say to folks, you may not understand your vote feels annihilating to another person. So how do we stay in community in those moments? And how do we create those guardrails? And how do I gently, or my other leaders, step in to say, hey, we're moving into an area that's less productive? And also, how do we counsel our clients on these pieces, knowing that staffs are not a monolith, people have different views, and that issues are very charged, and the media landscape, which we all are deeply engaged in, is highly polarized. So I think you're bringing up some of the things I've been concerned about, especially when people say, oh, well, companies just stick with your values, speak out in your values. I'm like, I think it's a lot more complicated than that in this context right now. But I do think this idea of the values, meaning how are we with each other? How are we with our clients? How are we in the world and in community? To reflect on that openly, for leadership to articulate that, and then allow other leaders to bring that to life in their spaces. And who are those positive, optimistic, caring conveners? I like a lot of what you're saying there.
I think one of the things as well is to really look at not just where your organization or your organization's leaders are speaking out, but where your organization and your organization's leaders are having impact.
Yeah.
And, I think there's a lot of hand wringing around what statements should we make and, and all that. And that's not nothing. I mean, it is important, and it is also very risky, particularly in a political environment where you're seeing, retribution happening for things that people said, and that is scary and it's real. And also at the end of the day, I mean, like, you can reflect on your own experience, and I will also reflect on the research that we do. That we ask, we give this sort of pick list of 28 different issues, everything from Israel and Palestine to handgun ownership to homelessness, pay equity, all these, a whole range of topics. And we ask people to pick 5 that they think their company should make a difference on, make an impact on, like actually, through policy, through giving, through product design, and so on. And very, 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 very consistently, we've seen the top 5 dominated by my health and well-being, job security and job creation, equitable pay, and diversity, issues related to diversity and fairness, and data privacy as well. And those top 5 dominate. And if you think about those are all things that most companies are already doing stuff about. And you can look at the policies. You can make sure that those are really, really people first policies, and that you are really correct to your employees' desires on those. And, and just really sort of drive those home. Even with something like job stability, yeah, you know what? You might need to lay off people. That is real. And you can still have policies that support those with whom you've parted ways, and do that, as you said, leaving with love, and, like doing that kind of action with some dignity. But what's interesting as well is that when you look at that again, generationally, the top 5 issues change significantly. And Gen Z and millennials are much more likely to rank LGBTQ plus and basically trans and these populations' rights and privileges and ability to operate. They're much more likely to rank gun control higher up. They're much more likely to rank education higher up. And so these things are, and it may be about like just stage in life, where people are, who they're surrounded by, what they're seeing in the media. And it's also true that the leaders of organizations need to think of employee populations not as like monolithic, but rather as a group of individuals who have agency in their life, who are making choices, who can either choose you or they can choose someone else. They could choose to do something great with and for you, or they can choose to do something great with and for someone else. And the negative is true too. They could choose to do something mean and nasty to you and mean and nasty to somebody. So all those things are in play. And again, it's like the more we can recognize that, this individuation of experience is, is like really, forgive me, integral to your work experience. That is going to be a key lever. And what you do through policy is going to have so much more impact than what you say through a press release.
Yeah, actually, I know my colleague Steve Halsey is going to be doing a upcoming podcast to talk with Rob at Harris Poll about some of the recent research they did, and this idea of words or context have some trust building characteristics. Actual impact has more trust building characteristics, but combining context and impact is the real hockey stick up to build trust. And as we wrap up our conversation, because there's a million more things we could talk about, but one of the things you're making me think of is in terms of going back to that question of how to help organizations and people that work for them understand where their values align or where they don't. One of the things I think is extraordinarily important now, especially say in a client service context like ours, but I think all organizations, is for leadership to really transparently narrate where they're facing their own dynamic tensions. So where is it that and where is it that we're very clear on what we believe? So, for example, when I can ladder things up to the 100,000-foot level of basic human rights, respect for people in their difference, celebration of difference, what it means to have a free press, what it means, what are democratic ideals aside from these ways that we're fighting with each other about them, what does it mean to have free flowing business, but also have compassion in that, right? So, but also being very clear of, hey, this is an environment where it's going to be hard for our clients to speak out on certain things. They need to lay a little bit more low here, but see how they're still practicing and creating impact here. If I can narrate that for my own stakeholders and also for my client stakeholders, then we can understand that the values alignment is not so off, because without that narration and without that context of like why we are speaking or not speaking, doing or not doing, why a client may be doing this but not saying that, it's very hard to translate. It's not legible, and that's one of the things I'm thinking about a lot too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're talking about, translating these ideas and principles into action, and does everybody understand what that translation process is? So if you have a business strategy and you just put the deck out there and you're like, okay, here's our business strategy, and then, 37 layers deeper in your organization or in the remote office or whatever, you ask people what the business strategy is, they're not going to understand that. They have to, like, people have to, like, learn things and internalize things in multiple ways, and be able to experience it in order to actually then go and do those things. And there's some great theory on this, like Bloom's taxonomy. It's like this hierarchy of how people learn things. It's very interesting, and how you do course design and that kind of stuff. But at Integral, we have this kind of employee experience formula it's very high level, but it can be really a helpful tool. If you're trying to create an employee experience that then ultimately drives some business value or some business outcome or societal value or societal outcome, there's just a few components. And the first one is listening. Big surprise. Like, how are you quantitatively and qualitatively understanding what the actual drivers are for perceptions and behaviors amongst this population? Whether you have 20 employees or 200,000 employees, can you get as nuanced an understanding of that population as possible? And then you introduce things like content, and like content might be if something as pithy as your and high level as your values, or something as sort of salt of the earth as like help text on on a HR website or something like that. You have all these interactions, which again, it could be something as sort of day to day as like the stand up that you have in the dispatch center before you head off to your shift, or the board meeting or the town hall with the CEO. And that's all driven by whatever the strategic intentions are. That it's is it a cultural intention? Is it a business expansion intention? Is it a talent acquisition or intention? So you put those things together: listening, strategic intention, content, interactions. That if you bring your real thoughtful, like very, very strategic self to interrogating the level of commitment you've made to those elements, you will be able to produce an employee experience that is, potentially incredibly scalable, because people understand what's going on and they can make decisions independently and operate independently, and also incredibly durable, because it's going to be sort of like self-correcting by this constant listening, adjusting, iterating. That is achievable, and it may be achievable at the whole enterprise level. I think that would be very audacious and ambitious, and I'm sure there are companies out there that are close. But I think, starting at a smaller level, like, okay, well, can we do this in one business unit, or can we do this in one team, or can we do this for one topical area, like how we're managing customer experience? You might be able to create an employee experience that then radiates, like that employee experience is reified in the customer experience, in the products that you make, in your corporate reputation. Like, the best brands are just totally built from the inside out. And you see that again and again and again.
Well, I think that's an amazing place to end, Ethan. I love it. I love that rubric. And this podcast is called Building Brand Gravity. So I always like to ask, what has you in its gravity today? An idea, a book, a podcast, something in the culture?
Yeah. You know what? I've recently been going into back issues of The New Yorker. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I've read some pieces by and about James Baldwin, and
Oh, wow.
just the ferocity of his intellect and his courage has really inspired me. And honestly, I mean, maybe this is just, growing up in the Midwest in the 80s, but I didn't really encounter much of his writing, and so now I'm kind of getting into it. And it led me to go watch a debate that he held in at Oxford. It's on YouTube. But anyway, just looking into James Baldwin has been amazing and inspiring. It was so ironic. I was thinking about it this morning. I knew you were going to ask this question. You were
Yeah.
kind enough to tell me. And as I was coming in on the subway with my dog, I looked down to pet her, and this guy's got a backpack on, and it's got this big button of a profile of James Baldwin. And I was like, oh my God, okay, so there's like, I don't know, kismet or karma or synergy, or I don't know, cosmic vibes are happening. But anyway, I highly recommend dipping into what James Baldwin had to say.
That's a magnificent recommendation. I co-sign that so much. And Ethan, thank you for your time today. It's been a joy to speak
Pleasure,
with you.
privilege. Thank you very much for inviting me in.
Everybody, there's more Building Brand Gravity wherever you get your podcasts, and we always appreciate your feedback. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.